Hello, my name is Kaustubh Sonawane, and I'm a resilience executive from the Young Scientist Journal. Today, I am joined by Dr. Singleton of the Emory University of the Department of Cell Biology. Nice to meet you, Dr. Singleton.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you too.
Before we begin, I'd like to know more about you. So what is your background exactly within neuroscience, and how did you specifically arrive in this field?
Yeah, so I went to Agnes Scott College for my undergraduate degree, which I earned in 2014. I double majored in neuroscience and classical history and culture. And then I attended Georgetown University for my PhD in neuroscience and defended in May of last year, so May of 2020. And I started my postdoc at Emory in July of 2020. And so I've always really been interested in neural development and neurodevelopmental disorders. And so that's really what my research focuses on, how the brain comes together with the hopes of we can understand that. We can also get a better understanding of how it falls apart and how we can fix that.
Oh, wow, that's very interesting. I've always been interested within this field. Um, so how do you really come to the conclusion, like how do you make that tie between the um, development of social biology with the biology aspect of it? Meaning, how did you come to this conclusion into your research of um, more rare neurodegenerative diseases? So how do you focus your research on that field?
Yeah, so my research right now focuses on, as you said, rare genetic diseases. And one of the reasons that I find them so fascinating is because with most rare genetic diseases, we actually know the cause. Like we know the specific mutation, um, the specific thing that results in that disease. But we don't know a lot about what the brain looks like. So we published a paper recently that shows that about 83% of rare genetic diseases are associated with the nervous system, that they predominantly affect children, and that in children they predominantly are their biggest symptoms and phenotypes are found within the nervous system. But we don't know a lot about exactly the cellular and molecular pathways that contribute to that. And so one of the things that the Faundez Lab focuses on and that my project focuses on is trying to repurpose FDA approved drugs and compounds so that we can try and ameliorate some of these deficits. So right now I'm looking at how we can essentially lessen the symptoms or restore function in cells that are deprived of copper, because Menkes disease is a rare genetic disorder that is associated with a dysregulation of copper. And copper is actually really important for numerous neuronal processes, which is something a lot of people don't know or really study. And so right now we're trying to establish a connection between copper and cellular homeostasis, but also copper and organelle integrity, such as like the mitochondria or the Golgi and things like that. So I really got started on it because it felt like there was just a breadth of knowledge and information that could be learned. So it just felt like a really great starting point because there were so many questions and like very little answers.
Okay, so it's all about like just finding that disparity within the scientific field and then filling that in with just interest within the
Yeah.
disease. That's really great. So specifically, uh, for decades, the scientific community has been open to new research, but closed off to new ideas. Within the scientific community, what does it really mean to be different, and how has this shaped your experiences with entering this field of neuroscience research?
Yeah. I always really appreciate this question because I think it contrasts really well the idea that science is all about discovery and new knowledge in terms of like the research that we do, but the community itself oftentimes is very homogenous. I think the neuroscience community is really diverse, and that I think is just because the brain is so fascinating and interesting, and everyone from physicists to engineers really want the ability to ask and answer challenging questions and make tools and resources. For me, as a Black queer woman, being in neuroscience sometimes has been really difficult, mainly because there aren't that many Black queer people who are open and out and feel comfortable being themselves in this really professional setting. Um, and so it's it's weird because in my everyday life, I know tons, tons of Black queer people, and our interactions and our friendship really drive me and support me in doing the work that I do. But when I go to work every day, it's very rare that, even right now I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, one of the Blackest cities in America, but I work at Emory University, one of the whitest institutions in America. And so that contrast for me is really hard. But I think those differences also, like you mentioned, they shape the way I view my science, they shape the questions that I'm interested in answering, and they also shape the engagement that I have with the scientific community, right? So my goal is always to make sure that there is representation and visibility of Black women and Black queer women in positions of power. And it's one of the reasons why I like do interviews and I like talk to people all of the time. And you can find me on social media, just like talking about science and my life, because I want Black women and Black girls to see that their dreams are possible and achievable. And so for me, it has shaped, it has made me more, my like differentness has made me more cognizantly aware of the need for more representation in science, but also a need for better accommodations for scientists as well in order to do that.
Of course, representation is very important, especially in science. Just having a role model like you, just building up to that position really helps others achieved in that path as well. So specifically beyond the lab, talking about this entire idea of representation and diversity, like building up within the scientific community, you've dedicated yourself to many social advocacy platforms and creating opportunities to promote education and inclusion. So how were you really able to tie your scientific background and research towards these initiatives? I remember reading about your specific organization of neuroscience and building up this education there.
Yeah. So over the summer, me and 20 other like amazing Black neuroscientists and advocates and allies made Black in Neuro, which is an organization that we're trying to like structure into a nonprofit right now. But our goal is to increase the representation and support and community for Black trainees and scholars in the field of neuroscience, whether that's neuroengineering or clinical neuroscience, in any way, shape, or form. And I think that one of the best things about Black in Neuro is that it does focus on community, right? And one of the things that a lot of DEI initiatives miss is the importance of community, right? You can't build a community with a group of people if you don't know both their struggle and their joy. And I think Black in Neuro gives people a space to do that, to be their authentic self and to talk about their happiness, their pains, their, love of Black culture and Black people. And I think that that's really valuable. I think I also tie my scientific and research interests into these initiatives because as a developmental neuroscientist, I'm interested in how things grow, how they develop, right? So for me, the development of an individual brain cell is really similar to the development of a happy, successful researcher. Those processes to me are linked. And so when we think about the way an individual cell develops, it uses both intrinsic, so like DNA and transcription factor sort of regulators, but it also uses extrinsic or environmental regulators. It physically interacts with things to reach its final target, to form a synapse. And when you think about the way that people develop and scientists develop, it's really the same, right? So my identity as a Black queer woman can be seen as an intrinsic factor. It represents my maturation in who I am. It's internal and a part of me. And then the environmental or extrinsic factors are my various decisions in life, right? My decision to go to an all-women's college for my undergrad degree, my decision to go to an interdisciplinary program for graduate school. Those things interact to make me who I am in the same way those intrinsic and extrinsic properties in cells interact to make neurons unique. And so for me, the connection is really obvious. And I try really hard to focus my research and my time on addressing big questions that go to both of those things. So how do neurons grow in normal and pathological conditions? What are the consequences for trainees who are in supportive lab environments versus negative lab environments? And how can we use these sort of ideas and principles to foster a sense of belonging in the scientific community for people who have been marginalized or minoritized in science?
I really love that parallel just between the development of a cell between a neuron and the interaction pathway and like the development of a scientific community as well. I think that's really especially important. Building a community with your organization in Black and Neuro, just creating that entire link between different neurons as you described it. So that's very interesting. Specifically about this exciting planned opening of the Singleton Lab in 2024, just beyond the community side of Black and Neuro and your social advocacy, how would your research efforts as well as like your social endeavors change with this newfound establishment?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a little bit, but not a lot. I think starting as a postdoc now, it's weird to think that there are only 3 years that separate me from having my own lab. But my hope is that the ideas and principles, like the parallel that we just talked about with neuron development and personal development, as well as the work that I do, will grow, that it will continue to, I will continue to grow as a mentor, as a teacher, as a PI, as a researcher by, engaging in workshops and talking to people and expanding my reach, both scientifically and in terms of advocacy. And that growth would really be the foundation for our lab, for my lab, I guess, wow, in the way that it goes. I think there's a lot of potential. I see a lot of potential in myself and in like my future lab in the way that I want it to be. I want it to be deeply diverse and incredibly inclusive and equitable, but also have a very firm grip and grasp on the idea of accountability and what that means to treat each other with respect and integrity, and how that only strengthens a scientific team. So for me, the biggest effort and change in that next part will be that I have to grow a lot, right? Like I have to make sure that I'm working to be the best leader that I can be in order to create the environment that I like so deeply envision.
Oh, I love that environment contrast, just like developing from not having like a very strong role model within this community and then moving towards creating your own lab and just fostering that community on your own. That's a very important task within growing the scientific field as well. More specifically on your research, actually, about this Menkes disease, what drove your investigation about rare genetic diseases? Like, I know that within neuroscience, there's many different fields, and usually, like, it's most likely large genetic diseases that are usually targeted within research. So, what makes you concentrate on these lesser known, less researched fields as well?
I think so. Part of it for me, like we talked about in the beginning, is just the idea that there are so many unanswered, very basic questions, right? There's a lot of work to be done with Menkes disease in terms of helping us understand how the brain processes and uses copper. And that, for me, the idea that it has that there are so many unanswered questions, and a lot of them are like low-hanging fruit, just in terms of like, how does excess copper affect mitochondria and mitochondria integrity? How do other metal toxins and their implication in rare diseases do the same thing? And we have so many tools to answer these questions and to study them. And I think that for me is really the driving factor. I've always wanted to work at a liberal arts college and start a lab that is primarily driven by undergraduate research. And so I feel like taking these rare genetic diseases and seeing these very like, not like easy questions, because what we do is hard, but like these like low hanging fruit kind of questions and these simple experiments that you can give an undergrad the opportunity to like work in Drosophila, to work with cell lines, to work with animal models. And so for me, I'm really shaping my research now around trying to fill in the gaps for these various rare genetic diseases, with the hope that I can take that research to a liberal arts college and give undergraduates really hands-on research experiences.
Okay, so basically within these rare genetic diseases, like the field, the learning curve is a bit less than having to research like into a field that's so niche, that's like difficult to get into in these larger, more neurodegenerative diseases.
And I think
Uh,
with the rare
sorry.
genetic disease research too, you can make it as big, right? Your question can be as big and as broad as you want. You can make it very niche, but because you're working within a disease concept and context, you have more resources. There are more sort of straightforward questions you can answer. And I think that that's valuable.
Especially with the social aspect of that research, it's like giving more opportunities for undergraduates, which usually like aren't given the ability to work in a direct lab. It's really important for these smaller neurodegenerative diseases and more rare, especially. So if you were in high school, once again, talking to the community of the Young Scientist Journal and our viewers, what would you do differently in your path towards scientific research if you were to make any changes?
Yeah, I fell in love with neuroscience in like 7th grade. We had this like hands-on scientific outreach thing where I got to dissect the sheep brain. It was really cool. But in general, as like a youth and a teenager, I was like a deeply apathetic teenager. I always did really well in school, and I loved reading and I loved writing, but I didn't really care about science. And it wasn't actually until I was like halfway through high school that I was like, oh yeah, I am going to do that neuroscience thing. Like I'm just going to, I remember I liked it, so I'm going to do it. And that path worked really well for me. Like I didn't do research in high school or as a high schooler. I just like hung out with my friends and listened to crappy music. So I guess if I could do it differently, maybe I would get into science a little bit earlier. But I also don't think that there's like 100% a right path of how to do it. Like I turned out pretty okay, and I didn't start doing research until college. I didn't start caring about science until college. I should say that. Like I really was just in it for bands. Just that's it.
Wow. But I really love that you just started that interest right back in 7th grade, where you didn't really have much of the resources or like just the ability to go into that research, and then foster that interest when you did receive those opportunities within college and beyond. So within college, how did you like foster this interest starting from undergraduate, especially if you didn't have like this laboratory that you were talking about before?
Yeah. So one of the best things about Agnes Scott College is that the classes are really small. So like, I think our biggest class is like 30 people. And that like at Agnes is like mind blowing. You're like, how am I going to get anything done? But when I was applying, so I knew I wanted to study the brain. When I was applying to college in 2010, there weren't that many neuroscience programs or like majors yet. So I specifically only applied to schools that already had established neuroscience majors. And then when I got to Agnes, it was like the number one thing that I talked about with like all of my professors. I would just go up to them after class and I would ask them, you know, more about the brain, more about like getting involved in science, what a career in science even look like how does one become a scientist? I had like no idea, not a clue. And one of them encouraged me to apply to the NINDS, what is it? Enhancing Neuroscience Undergraduate Education through Diversity program, which is basically like a 2-year fellowship that pays you to work in a lab and do research at like various institutions. And I was so nervous about applying. I remember like writing the application and like my cute little essay and being like, there's no way these people are going to let me in. I don't know a thing about science. Like I'm in like intro biology and it's the first time I've ever like picked up a pipette. And for whatever reason, they did let me in. And I like that journey really started from there. So I think my biggest advice in terms of getting started in science is to like ask your professors, ask people, like reach out to people, reach out to me. We can like chat and figure out the fellowships that you qualify for, what's going on in your area, how you can get experience. And I think it's also to remember that on some level, it is about the journey, right? Like you do have to sometimes work in certain labs or study certain things when you're starting out to realize if you like them or not. Like I rotated in a cognitive lab and a lab that did electrophysiology. And I was like, I don't like this. This is not for me, actually. I don't like this at all. And so I felt like bad about it, but it was a good opportunity because it helped me like narrow down the type of research I wanted to do. So I think that was a very long-winded way of saying to just reach out to your professors and ask around and use like social media to talk to people too.
Yeah, especially in the information age, networking is one of the top skills. Just you need it for anything. But your story really tells like it's just getting past that first like feeling of imposter within like the field and just going for it actually. So obviously, like COVID-19 has been a huge impact on your work. I noticed like you started your research on in the Faundez Lab within the July of 2020. So how has COVID-19 really impacted your work within the research of Menkes disease?
Yeah. So in terms of like my ability to do work, so one of the hard things I think about being someone that works in like a wet lab is that you physically have to go to work. Like I can't do my science from my house. I wish that I could. That'd be really cool. Actually, it would get boring very quickly. But um, in terms of starting a new like lab position and a new postdoc position, it's been a little overwhelming at times. I feel like in general, COVID and this era has brought about like more work for people. Like there's an intensity in the amount of productivity people are trying to like make up for lost time. Um, when I teach students in the lab and like I also adjunct as a professor. So when I teach, I can see the physical stress that my students are having, trying to just like catch up to baseline. And so for me, it's created in terms of like the ability to do my research, not much has changed, right? Emory has been really great about our COVID restrictions and when we go in and the safety precautions. But in terms of like the well-being of people in general, I think it's one of the things that I worry about the most, right? Like because of Zoom, you can like work more, you can like take meetings at home, you can do more things. And so I think it's definitely pushed me to engage with people more, to work more. I've made more friends. I have more like internet friends than I've ever had in my life. But I also feel like I have more stress sometimes. And so it's trying for me to find a balance in those things.
Yeah, the work and relaxing time dynamic has definitely changed. Just having more time to work sometimes can be good, but also not the best for your own sanity, of course. And then finally, what would be your advice to the young scientists across the world soon to watch this interview? What would you give to aspiring neuroscientists and just students going into the field of science and not really knowing what to do?
So I would give two big pieces of advice that I tend to always give. The first is to have faith in yourself. Science is hard because of the nature of what it is. It's discovery, it's learning something for the first time before anybody else. And over time, that process can be really challenging for students. And one of the most important things I think you can do to combat that is to have faith in yourself. Know how much you have grown, how much you want this, how important your passion is, and your role within science, right? Science is nothing without the next generation of scientists, and that will forever continue to be true. And if you ever lose faith in yourself, borrow someone else's. You can borrow some of mine, borrow your mentors, your parents, your grandparents, your friends. Build a community for yourself of people that believe that you can do this, because there's no 100% right way or path to be a scientist. I don't think that you need a PhD to be a scientist. I know I consider undergraduate researcher scientist. I consider anybody that thinks science is interesting and does science a scientist. So that's the first thing, to have faith in yourself, and don't don't worry if your faith wavers, because it will, but to make sure you have people around that believe in you. And then the second piece of advice I would give um, is to shoot your shot. Like email somebody, DM them on Twitter, talk to people, like cold email people, and really shoot your shot. Ask about research experiences, ask about fellowships or scholarships, talk to people, and they're more than willing to help you. People love being contacted, I think, about these kinds of things, like just from an enthusiastic young scientist who wants to get more involved. So don't be afraid or think that someone's too busy. Like it might take them a second to get back to you, but really shoot your shot and reach out, ask about any of the things you want to know from the people that you find interesting.
Okay, so just go for it, honestly.
Start your own
Uh,
lab.
this is all right. Thank you for your time, Dr. Singleton. It was really interesting, and I loved hearing all of your stories about how to really get involved in the scientific community. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.